You're on.
Well, a very good evening to you once again. We've come to this point, the final evening, the final session, and what has been a week-long extravaganza on discussions organized by the National Contract Workers and General Employees Association. We've had 4 really purposeful sessions on this issue. The challenge for us to vaccinate, to operate, that's the state's proposition to us. And we've looked at it from all sides. When we began on Monday, we looked at the issue of the general history and purpose of vaccines and the pros and cons of COVID-19 vaccines. Our panelists on that evening were Dr. David Bratt, Dr. Joel David Nanton, and Dr. Denise Soifat Angus. On evening 2, we looked at the legality of mandatory vaccines in Trinidad and Tobago. With us there were attorneys Travis Sinanan and Kurt Waldron, and trade union and credit union official Joseph Remy. On evening 3, the rights of the employer and the employee in relation to mandatory COVID-19 vaccines and mandatory PCR tests. And we walked that road with Diane Haddad, businesswoman, business executive Keston Nanku, a trade unionist and member of parliament, Rudy Indar Singh, and trade union leader and representative of trade union organizations, Mr. Michael Anizet. And then last evening, we looked at the proposition, the segregation between vaccinated and unvaccinated persons. And in the panel that evening, businessman Rajiv Dipti, president of the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. David Muhammad of the Black Agenda Movement and the Kwame Tourist Center, and trade union executive Ozzy Warwick, as well as a lead Muslim leader and community leader Omar Abdullah. And this evening, we're looking at the recommendations and the suggestions and proposals which were made by the speakers during the course of the discussions over the last 4 days. And to do that, none other person than the president of the NCWGEA. That's Mr. Christopher Jofi. Let's just tell you a little bit about him. He's currently the president of the National Contract Workers and General Employees Association of Trinidad and Tobago, and he's successfully held several posts of leadership in various spheres of life. He has many years of experience in particularly the labor arena. He's assistant treasurer of the National Trade Union Center. Otherwise, he's also been first vice president of the Public Services Association. He served in that capacity between 2009 and 2018, and a member of the Central Statistical Office, the CSO, Implementing Steering Committee for the National Statistical Institute of Trinidad and Tobago, a member of the National Insurance Appeals Tribunal, chairman of the PSA Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards section for 10 years, and 10 years also the General Council and Conference of Delegates of Representatives for 10 years in the PSA. He's a past interim president of the Student Guild at the Cipriani Labour College and a temporary senator in the Parliament in Trinidad and Tobago. He's been a past president of the Trinidad and Tobago Armed Forces Veterans Association, and he served as a soldier in the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment from 1978 to 1990. There's much more on this list here, but I think his modesty will suggest that we don't read you all the litany of what is listed there, because he has some speaking to do this evening. He alone is on the field this evening, and he's talking about how he's been able to pull together the recommendations and suggestions which came in abundance from the teams of professionals we just read out to you. Good afternoon, my friend. Good afternoon, comrade.
Good
evening.
Thank you, Andy, and good evening to you, our listening and viewing viewers and members of the team. I am very happy to be able to say that we had a very stimulating conversation when this whole webinar came together, and today is really a conclusion of it all. But I want to also make it clear that it is easy for me to sit here and articulate the association's position on this national issue without recognizing the indispensable contributions of those in the engine room who made this project possible. I am therefore making it clear that this webinar was a collaborative effort from concept to completion, and I am fortunate to have had the support of every member of the team, and they will be recognized when the vote of thanks is done. For the records, however, this webinar was not about anti-vaccination. And for clarification, the association's organizers did extend invitations to the Minister of Health or his representative, the Attorney General or his representative, and the head of the Law Association, none of whom responded. My role here is simply to point out the highlights and general consensus gleaned from the issues in each segment, as well as the recommendations for the way forward suggested by the participants, and hope that our contribution to this polemic issue of vaccination can serve to encourage the maintenance of harmony in Trinidad and Tobago based on the contributions of our esteemed panelists. Firstly, I need to point out that this is not a worker and employer issue only, since in my view, the citizens appeared to be concerned not only of the efficacy of the vaccine, but the manner in which it was tabled by those who have been elected to represent our collective interest nationally, and their manner of handling the purchase of the vaccines has contributed to the lack of trust and the transparency in the process. One red flag was raised when the policymakers refused to inform the people of Trinidad and Tobago about the purchase arrangement by citing non-disclosure agreements. Comrade Rudy Indar Singh alluded to that oversight in his contribution. I believe that the collective intelligence and critical thinking ability of the citizens was disregarded when the country was told that we cannot be accounted to in respect of the acquisition of the vaccines for the population. This is a democracy, and you would recall that Brother Muhammad eloquently elucidated on that matter for the benefit of our viewers. As such, good governance demands transparency and accountability to the population, and maybe it would not have contributed to the situation of vaccines reaching expiry before fulfilling its intended purpose. Another concern has to do with the behavior of our leaders in high office, treating with the issue of mandatory vaccination, when it appears that they have attempted to push the employer class in the forefront and tacitly supporting them to coerce their workers to take the vaccine on pain of job loss. This has resulted in the president of the industrial court having to step forward boldly and make it pellucidly clear that they will be violating the principles of good industrial relations in the absence of a national policy or discussion and agreement with the unions representing those workers. Even so, the change in terms and conditions can only be accomplished if the employers are hiring new employees. The three labor federations have also clearly posited that the ILO conventions, Industrial Relations Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act, collective agreements, and industrial relations principles and practices have bearing on the issue of vaccination and cannot be ignored. The legality of vaccination and vaccine uptake by the citizens have been examined using case law and going in depth about efficacy, private versus personal interest, and welfare versus the public interest. It should be noted that this issue has the possibility of further fracturing our already fragmented society of 1.4 million people along added lines of them and us, which should be avoided at all cost. However, the general consensus, according to our esteemed panelists, is as follows. Dr. Bratt echoed sentiments of pro-vaccination. He emphasized the efficacy of vaccination throughout history, referencing successful immunization for polio, smallpox, measles, and having vaccinated children for 50 plus years. He, however, indicated that the information shared by government and the Minister of Health with medical practitioners and the medical fraternity about COVID-19 vaccination was insufficient and called on the government to do better with regards to informing the population and the general public about taking the vaccine. He also recommended more education and information sharing among the public so that persons who are hesitant will be able to make an informed decision in light of the vaccine not being mandatory. Dr. Tilak Singh was also pro-vaccination and concurred with Dr. Bratt's position. With relation to mandatory vaccination, he was of the view that in the event that the vaccine is made mandatory, people should be properly informed about the benefits of taking the vaccine and protecting their health. Dr. Sawyerfat Angus indicated she was not anti-vaccination and concurred with the views of Dr. Bratt and Dr. Tilak Singh's. However, she opted for alternative measures to the vaccination of children. She suggested that instead of inoculation, exposure to open air spaces and behavior modification techniques can curb the effects of the pandemic, as there are also psychosocial effects of being vaccinated and unvaccinated. Dr. Sawyerfat Angus was against mandatory vaccination, especially when there were alternative measures to promote the health of our citizens. All in all, the panelists recommended a transparent approach to the information which is released by the government and the Ministry of Health about vaccines, its pros and cons. The discourse with respect to the legal professionals and the representative of labor and Phyton, which involved Mr. Kurt Waldron, attorney at law, Mr. Joseph Remy Phyton, and Mr. Travers Sinanan, attorney at law. Mr. Waldron gave a representation of a case from the European Court of the Human Rights with a view to bring into context how governments may infringe on a person's fundamental and sacrosanct right to privacy. He then did a comparative analysis with the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago to remind the viewers that while in European law, it would contravene the sacrosanct right of those mentioned in the case, ultimately, mandatory vaccination was beneficial to the majority of the population. Mr. Sinanan reminded the panel that while the case presented by Mr. Waldron was excellent, this was Trinidad and Tobago, and the Supreme Court for the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago's jurisdiction was still the Privy Council or the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. From his view, mandatory vaccination will result in a myriad of civil claims being brought against the government, especially with the idiosyncratic nature of each individual's physiology and their reaction to inoculation. However, Mr. Sinanan emphasized the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. He noted that while the possibility of mandatory vaccination in Trinidad and Tobago exists, as a democratic society, the citizens must have a right to choose. Mr. Remy spoke for the lay persons and expressed the view and recommended that the methods of communication with respect to vaccination has to be more transparent given the volatile nature of the pandemic. He strongly emphasized the need for dialogue with all relevant stakeholders and representatives before rolling out mandatory vaccination in the workplace. And he also reiterated the statement of Ms. Deborah Thomas Felix, President of the Industrial Court, that vaccination cannot be done unilaterally. Mr. Remy ended by stating he was not anti-vax. However, he was strongly against mandatory vaccination in the workplace. Mr. Nanku, he indicated that there were operational adjustments to be made since the middle of the pandemic and prior to vaccination, which kept organizational viability afloat. And this related to the rights of the employer and employee in relation to COVID-19 vaccines and mandatory PCR tests. Mr. Anisette recommended that the government engage in social dialogue since Trinidad and Tobago was a signatory to the ILO Conventions of 187 and 155 and cannot continue to place this responsibility of mandatory vaccination on employers in the absence of a national policy. Mr. Nanku also pointed out that vaccination was necessary for the economic recovery of the country, and while he agreed it was a person's choice to be vaccinated, mandatory vaccination may be necessary to put Trinidad and Tobago back to some kind of regularity. He cited issues of ethics and morality, as the vaccinated can be entitled to wanting a safe zone, and stated that he trusted the government, the science, and was prepared to do everything possible to bring TNT back to normalcy. In spite of this view, and after spirited discussion, he agreed that mandatory vaccination may not be the only way to economic recovery, but would certainly be the first step for persons to regain their livelihoods. Ms. Diane Haddad was clear that she was against mandatory vaccination and PCR tests for workers, as it was part of a larger pattern of control through use of fear by the employer. She indicated that while the government had not put forth any national policy on mandatory vaccination, the employers were told that if their staff did not vaccinate, they cannot operate. A key point, Ms. Haddad expressed her empathy for workers and stressed maintaining levels of motivation among staff was more important than forced inoculation. She stressed further that mandatory vaccination will affect workers' mental and personal states and in turn affect their general output. She also expressed her concern that while the government had rolled out its vaccination centers, there was not enough information to curb hesitancy among the population, and indicated that one of the red flags that made her decide not to make it mandatory for her staff, but it must be their personal choice. Mr. Inder Singh emphasized the right to choose and indicated that although he was a politician in the opposition, he was aware that he was not on a political platform and kept his views objective to this particular subject matter. Mr. Inder Singh indicated that the issue of vaccine hesitancy came from an issue of trust and the issue of leadership. He also indicated that the population was hesitant because the government failed to inform the public properly. He stated that if government rolled out the information about the history, pros and cons of vaccinations, and the benefits of the COVID-19 vaccine transparently, instead of hosting press conferences each week, there may have been less hesitancy among the citizenry. He also echoed the need to have the medical professionals educate and inform the public instead of threats and ultimatums placed on the public by the Prime Minister, as Trinidad and Tobago, to the best of his knowledge and ours, is still a democratic society. On the issue of segregation between the vaccinated and unvaccinated, Mr. David Mohammed started the discussion by expressing the view that the issue was also a human rights and civil rights issue, as it affected all persons regardless of race, religion, class, etc. Mr. Mohammed recommended that if mandatory vaccines were to become national policy, then the options of homeschooling and private candidacy should be considered by parents affected by mandated the children to be inoculated against COVID-19. Mr. Dipty asked viewers to consider that if 500,000 persons are vaccinated and the rest of the population of 1 million are unvaccinated, would there be an economic fallout due to the disparity and government's direction on mandatory vaccination? He recommended treating the segregation of vaccinated and unvaccinated with empathy and understanding, citing that it was a sensitive situation that would take time for persons to make informed decision given the volatility of the information promulgated by the government. While Mr. Dipty would have encouraged persons to become vaccinated, and he provided facilities to do so, he was of the view that mandatory vaccination will lead to segregation. He also indicated that leaders should promote the benefits of the vaccine over the adverse effects. However, ultimately, the choice of inoculation should be left up to the individual taking it. Mr. Abdullah stated that the president of the Industrial Court made a clear statement, and he was in agreement with that statement, and questioned how come the government still foisted mandatory vaccination upon citizens, especially children who were not able to make legal decisions. He indicated the segregation was akin to South Africa's racial apartheid, but this would now be a medical apartheid. He expressed serious concern at the government for making children disobey their parents to be vaccinated without their permission, and indicated that the government made several errors in the information, transparency, and education to the population. Mr. Abdullah also expressed concern over the acquisition of vaccines from countries like China, where the government signed non-disclosure agreements to obtain the drugs. He reiterated that and asked which democracy existed whereby non-disclosure agreements were made by government without first consulting with the citizens. Mr. Abdullah recommended that the government be held accountable for the errors and mismanagement of the pandemic. Also, he stated that even if 30% were inoculated and 70% were hesitant, this hesitancy came from mistrust of the government, and in a democracy, the 70% are still within their sovereign right to refuse vaccination. He also recommended that government set up a vaccine adverse effect reporting system, a VAERS system, committee, as is done in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and begin clinical trial testing of the vaccine, as vaccines such as Pfizer had specific caveats of adverse effects on children and the elderly. Mr. Warwick spoke as the JTAM representative and reiterated and concurred with the views of the other panelists. He stated that JTAM is opposed to mandatory vaccination and the segregation of persons based on their medical status. He recommended that if government has to mandate vaccination as a workplace policy to segregate workers, then it should be done in compliance with the national OSH policy and the required risk assessment procedure to be used to validate their actions of safe zones. Mr. Warwick opined that it was a person's or a worker's right to choose, and the hesitancy emerged from a system and leadership failures of government. Generally, all panelists agreed that government had to do better in educating the people of the country. Summary of segments 1 to 4. Moving forward, a clearly defined governmental policy must be put on the table, as there seems to be none in place. This absence of a policy may have the general population guessing as to the next steps, and that government as the largest employer ought to lead from in front, and may even give rise to employers taking advantage of employees and even contribute to segregation in the national community. If there is to be confidence in any vaccination program by the government, they must allow the health professionals the leeway to speak to the community honestly, bringing real data on damaging effects or even the deaths caused by the vaccine in Trinidad and Tobago, and not attempt to use the political machinery to bully the population into taking something that may or may not cause them harm. Since we are all supposed to have freedom of choice in this democratic state. I thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that sort of lucid capturing of the essence of the discussions all week. Let me just relax it a little bit and ask you a couple of questions personally, because I'm looking down the list of what I have in front of me here, and I get a sense as to why you are, so characteristically cool from the time that I've known you for a number of years. I see you're a karateka. You're champion karateka, and that you represented Trinidad and Tobago at the World International Full Contact Karate Championships in Japan in 1987, and you were coach of the Trinidad and Tobago contingent at the Global Point and Knockout Tournament in 2013 and 2014. Illuminate a little bit about those aspects of who you are.
Well, comrade, I genuinely believe that sport in this country, especially sport like karate, is one of the vehicles for promoting personal discipline and self-control. And sometimes the difference between going over the edge on issues is really how you treat with it. And karate training, well, I have been in that discipline since the days of junior secondary school, which is, I attended Barataria Junior Secondary School. And it has always been part of my life. I also see life in the military because I was also in the cadet force in Belmont Boys Secondary School. And I believe that that has helped me to try to maintain control in the face of all things that would normally cause others to fly off the edge. I believe that it has benefited me, and I try to instill that in my students, and that has led to my being able to represent Trinidad and Tobago in Japan, and also to take our team, now that I am in charge of branch of karate here, to Japan twice, and they carry themselves very well. I genuinely believe that martial arts is one of the essential factors of my cool and controlled demeanor. Because trust me, there have been situations where I believe that if I wasn't if I wasn't looking at myself, I would have made some errors, which would have probably not gone down well. Yeah, so I genuinely believe that martial arts is a good way of bringing up these young people and helping them to be good citizens, because self-control, discipline, and be able to contribute to our society is one of the mediums to achieve that.
Yeah, and you were the winner of the Central American Full Contact Karate Championships in Costa Rica in 1986. And I want to. You said you went to BJSS. I have a younger brother who used to go there, who went there in those early days, and so on. And you're not alone in this respect. Like going to a school like that, those schools were demonized when they were just introduced, and we have this obsession with prestige schools and non-prestige schools. What does somebody say about somebody like yourself? And I say, there are many of you all out there who don't get the recognition that you should get, coming from Barataria Junior Sec and having this kind of CV.
Well, I think that we live in a society where it is a lot of these, what you call the prestige schools, are promoted, and you and I know that this issue of the police service commission, that school is in the headlines these days, right?
Mhm.
And what we have to realize is that a lot of good citizens do come out of the junior secondary system. I attended Barataria Junior Secondary, prior to which I was a student in the Seventh-day Adventist School, primary school in Mission Road in San Juan. And then after the junior secondaries were created, I attended Belmont Boys for my final 2 years before making up the complete 5 years. In Belmont, I was exposed to the cadet force, and a lot of people play down these junior secondary schools, but I think that that is a fatal mistake, even though many of the people who come from there don't blow their horns, as it were.
Yeah, you have a master's degree in business administration from Anglia Ruskin University in the UK, a diploma in photography from the Schools of Modern Photography in New Jersey, USA, a diploma in broadcast announcing for radio and television from the Center for Media Arts in New York, USA, certificates from Cipriani Labor College in Occupational Health and Safety and Human Resource Management, as well as a national diploma in labor studies. And you have formal training in mediation skills from the Alternative Dispute Resolution Center in Trinidad and Tobago.
That's correct. I'll tell you a little story. When I joined the Bureau of Standards in 1992, shortly thereafter, I was elected as the worker representative there of the PSA, and I was like, I have no problem serving, and right away, I was in a dark place because I didn't know what to do with respect to representing workers. So when I was presented with the collective agreement and I went through it, I realized that, listen, I needed to do some training, and I took time off after work on the Saturdays, and I did the 10 Saturday Industrial Relations program, and then I eventually moved to the 2 weeks program, and then, well, I was put on the General Council of the PSA to represent the interests of the workers at the Bureau, and that lasted the full length of time that I was in the PSA until I got onto the executive with our current president of the PSA. So, I like the idea of lifelong learning and service to others. And if people go onto my WhatsApp, they will see my karate instructor, and the scrap line I have there really is service before self. And I try to live that.
Yes. All right, so let's come back to this week of discussions we've had here. Everyone, to a man, from day one, from night 1 to night 4, congratulated the union for coming up with this idea, for seeing the need for it, and for bringing it off. And we know some of the challenges we had to find. You all had to find the guests and to get them to agree and discuss the topics and so on. What led you all to consider having a session like this?
Well, that about because I had one of the panelists. He and we go back a way, because while I was in the PSA, he was representing the employer, and we met across the table at the Ministry of Labor, and after the life went on, and I opened this trade union called National Contract Workers and General Employees Association. We connected up, and we had a conversation one day on the phone, and he mentioned that workers were being compelled to take this vaccine, or else they will not be able to work. And he was giving me a personal experience that he was having, and we decided that, well, I was in support of it. We decided that this is something that the union should try to hold or host a webinar on, so that we can address issues which are affecting other workers in the country, and not just workers, but this has filtered all the way down to independent contractors, because some of them are even being told that if you don't have your workers vaccinated, you cannot get a contract with us. So it cuts really deep, and the association decided, well, this is something that we would need to lend our voice to. And I mean, well, the rest is history.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about the discussions you would have had with others for the idea, the germination of the idea to have a trade union representing contract workers and general employees, people who are working sometimes at pain of immediate dismissal. You know, they're not recognized anywhere. They can't form a bargaining unit. Contract workers. I remember when that term began to be proliferating in the country in the early 2000s, there was a sign of concern. You have so many people in the public service, for instance. Now there are more contract workers in the public service than public servants on the public establishment. So that there must have been that thinking, a unique kind of thing. This is a unique kind of union representing contract workers and general employees, one or two people who might be working in one or two places and so on. Talk a little bit about what it required to decide to have a union like this.
It came about because after doing the master's program, and I felt that what was happening in the public service was a way of making workers be able to perform by making them feel insecure in their employment. And the job that they have, the renewability of their contract is at the whim and fancy of those who hire them. In the public service, that is it's rife. And I decided that, I mean, contract workers are workers too. And unfortunately, most of them feel that they cannot become unionized, which is a sad thing, because I tell people that ignorance is no excuse. And when one looks at the definition of a worker under the Industrial Relations Act, these people who are on contract, they are covered as well. It is simply that for most workers who are on contract, they are so they so want to protect their employment that they will not become unionized for fear of, in other words, giving up that right for fear of losing their jobs. And I felt that by putting this union together, we will be able to dispel that with the passage of time. And I mean, it's growing slowly.
Yeah, because in a lot of cases, I mean, I was the CEO of a state enterprise, and the proliferation of state enterprises in the country, most, if not all of them, every single man jack is on contract.
Yeah. It is sinfully so. And I say that because the public service needs reorganizing so that the performance levels can improve. But unfortunately, the policymakers seem to think that holding a whip, which is contract work over the heads of the employees of the public service, is going to achieve that. But for most of them, it has failed bitterly. From my view, the problem in the public service, and I need to make that, put that on the record, the problem in the public service has to do with management. The management of the public service is weak, and they have moral problems. Some people are just contented with doing just enough to be able to pass the time, get paid. It's an indictment. It may be an indictment on the recognized majority union, because people quick to run and say the union is to blame, but that is not necessarily so, because the managers themselves fail to be able to motivate and encourage and stimulate their employees and staff to be able to get them to perform.
Yeah. Let me ask you, in cases where there may be workers who are in a department or in a plant or in an agency, whether it's public or private, where there is a recognized majority union, and somebody decides, well, to exercise their own option to come and join this union, how easy or how not easy that is?
Well, it is a simple matter of them just getting in touch with us. We are on the website, and they could contact us and come in, fill out our application form. It is their right under section 71(1) to be or not to be a member of any union of their choice. Those who are in recognized sections, they will have their own challenges as it relates to us being able to bargain for them. But when it comes to giving them representation in terms of discipline and other issues, and even guidance on matters that affect their terms and conditions, we are quite capable and willing to assist them.
Yeah. All right. So a little bit more to the week of decisions, discussions that you encapsulated in your presentation there so expertly. So where to from here on this issue about Vaccinate to operate? What's the next step? What's an outcome of this?
What we hope to do is to collate this information, and then we are going to communicate with the principals at the national level, letting them know what came out of the webinar and what were the recommendations. As we would have indicated, we would have reached out to them in order to put balance and objectivity into it. And we believe that the panelists did an excellent job in it. And I must say, you, Andy, you were able to do a fantastic job of gleaning the information from them on all sides. And we hope that it will contribute towards charting the direction for a better Trinidad and Tobago in this pandemic.
Yeah. And what's your view on the question of tripartism? Because in a situation in which the trade union movement walked away for another time from the tripartite arrangement, all the leaders who went to that meeting with the Minister of Planning, who is the chair of the what is now called the NTAC, talked about the importance of tripartism so that it is a reality that can't go away. And that meeting suggested that, because I was wondering, well, why did they go if there is this animosity between the government and the labor movement as to why they would have left? But this says that there will always be issues on which there can be no going forward without a tripartite approach or the best attempts at them.
We live in a country where this is a plural society, and there will always be different views coming on issues. But we need to put the country first. We need to see what needs to be done to drive Trinidad and Tobago and make it a better place, not only economically, but socially, to be able to affect people's quality of life and standard of living. And we cannot get away from it. And the structures are there. But when you have parties being rigid in their positions, that is what happens, right? We need to be able to arrive at consensus and win-win without losing our grounding as organizations with vested interest, whether it is business, whether it is labor, or the government.
You think this issue and the fact of this meeting sort of reopens the door for the trade unions to go back in, fall back in on the NTAC? Because there are people who said, well, whatever the issue is that you shouldn't remain in there and fight it out. Why walk away?
Well, I think that the labor fraternity is healing its differences and, for want of a better word, maturing. They are facing up to the fact that it cannot work if we continue to be fragmented, and in the end everybody loses and the opportunists benefits. And that might be a bit of a contradiction, because I just said everybody loses, but I should say the majority loses, and that's the workers and the ordinary citizens. Because when we are not when the teams don't come together, decisions are taken. I have seen where even at the level of the firms, when the union walks away, the employer is happy to take the particular decision that he wants to take. So I am saying essentially that we need to continue to stay together and work it out and arrive at consensus, because at the end of it all, it affects Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And the citizens.
Yeah. What do you think the two ministries, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of the Attorney General, missed by choosing not to be part of these discussions this week? You think they shortchanged themselves? They shortchanged the country?
Definitely. And I say that with all sincerity, because one, the legal perspective has been lost on them because they could have contributed to it. Trinidad and Tobago is a democracy, and all of us have views. And those of us who are elected to represent our interest have a duty when organizations such as ours invite them to be part of these kinds of activities, so that they will get the opportunity to even share and benefit from the other side in terms of the perspective, and to lend clarity if there is concerns that need to be clarified, issues that need to be clarified. And when the Attorney General didn't respond, and the minister or they didn't send a representative, I think they would have, by their silence, attempt to say, suck it, sit down by it, because we say this is how it is. But that is not, that ought not to be the way, because at the end of the day, the persons who are taking the vaccine, the persons who are workers are citizens, and the citizens are voters. They need to bear that in mind.
Okay, I at the becoming the point where it's for me to, I want to thank Ms. Morales and Ms. Almorales, Shema Almorales, and Kurt Waldron, and the guys who've been doing the IT for this all week. My special thanks to all of them. But I give you the final word to take us out.
All right. At this point in time, we have, as part of our plan, to allow Ms. Shema Morales, who is the PRO on the committee, to move the vote of thanks. All right. I really thank Trinidad and Tobago and you, Andy, and the rest of the team for your unstinting support in bringing this webinar, to making it the success that it is, and the panelists for taking the time. But I would leave Shoma to articulate those sentiments. Thank you once more, Shoma.
Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, to vax or not to vax? This is the question. Remains the national conversation. However, we are confident that a number of concerns were addressed by our panelists, who came from the medical, legal, labor, and business sectors. On behalf of the National Contract Workers and General Employees Association of Trinidad and Tobago, I have been asked to move the vote of thanks. I would like to express our gratitude to the esteemed panelists for their presence and contribution to this webinar, Vaccinate to Operate the Issues. What we would have witnessed over the last 4 days were persons well respected in their various fields, taking time off selflessly from their hectic schedules to give dispassionate views on this national issue. We started with segment 1, the general history and purpose of vaccines and the pros and cons of the COVID-19 vaccines. A heartfelt thanks to the following: Dr. Bratt, Dr. David Bratt, who enlightened us with his perspective on the history of vaccinations and the benefits for children. Dr. Denise Sawyerfat Angus, who highlighted the need for transparency, dialogue, and education from the authorities. Dr. Joel Tiluxin, who shared on the value of being vaccinated whilst dispelling negative narratives. Thank you all. Segment 2, the legality of mandatory vaccines in Trinidad and Tobago. Our sincere thanks goes to Mr. Kurt Waldron and Mr. Travis Sininan, both attorneys at law, who eloquently gave us the law behind mandatory vaccines and the right of individuals under the Constitution. Mr. Joseph Remy, who shared a comprehensive viewpoint on vaccine hesitancy and the lack of transparency by governments. Segment 3, rights of the employer and employee in relation to mandatory COVID-19 vaccines and mandatory PCR tests. A special thanks to the following: Mr. Michael Anizet, who reminded us that in addition to vaccinations, employees need to pay attention to other factors on the job that affect employees negatively. Mr. Kester Nanku, who shared his perspective on what is required of both the employer and employee to bring about economic recovery. Mr. Rudy Indar Singh, who highlighted the lack of substantial dialogue between the leaders and the populace. Additionally, the lack of trust in the authorities during this pandemic. Ms. Diane Haddad, who highlighted that even in this pandemic, employers should be obligated to take care of their employees as they are the greatest asset of every employer. Thanks again. Segment 4, segregation between vaccinated and unvaccinated persons. This team of panelists consisted of Mr. David Mohammed, Mr. Rajiv Dipti, Mr. Omar Abdullah, and Mr. Ozzy Warwick. We express our gratitude to you for a spirited session. And whilst each of you had different presentations and angles, the conclusion was no to segregation. Thank you, gentlemen. Segment 5. We thank the President of the National Contract Workers and General Employees Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Christopher Jofield, who gave an overview of this webinar and recommendations for the way forward. Our moderator, Mr. Andy Johnson. Our gratitude knows no bounds. Thank you, sir. As someone described you, Andy, you are the bomb.com. To the team of persons who worked in the background, Alvaro, David, Kurt, Stacy. To make this webinar happen, thank you, thank you, thank you. Did I say thank you? To our IT support, Joy Communications International Limited. Our heartfelt thanks to that engine room. To our audience, who were quite excited for this event and who participated every evening by way of your questions, please accept our endless gratitude and plenty love-ups. To Mr. Errol Fabian and Gael the Caribbean, all our love and thanks to you. In conclusion, last and by no means least, we thank Almighty God who showed us his love, favor, and wisdom. Thank you, Father. Have a good night, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are all better off because of this week. I'm Andy Johnson. I'm out.